Hey everybody, I thought I'd make a video talking about what makes books collectible. Pretty much everything I know about the topic I'll funnel into this video. Here we go. When you collect, there's kind of two sides of it. You can just collect what are called reading copies, which you don't care about the condition of or the value of. You're not looking to hold them for a long time and have sort of something valuable. You're just looking to actually read all of an author's books, maybe everything in a certain publisher, short-lived publisher. You're just basically collecting to collect the content. The other kind of collection that we're going to talk about today is collecting collectible books or rare books. And there's a lot more factors that go into that. If you just want to buy reading copies of books, you can go online and find a $2 or $3 copy of pretty much every single book there is, unless literally the book was an extremely limited edition that, from some no-name press, and then that can be very difficult to find. But in general, most books that you'd be interested in owning are easy to get and are cheap no matter what they are. So that brings us to, well then, if that's the case, if you can get almost any book for $2 or $3, what makes a book collectible? So what makes a book collectible encompasses a whole range of things. We're going to talk about some of them. Obviously, the one thing that most people know, the number one thing that makes a book collectible is it being a first edition. Now, what is a first edition? Well, a first edition is generally thought to be the first state, in other words, the first typesetting, digital or otherwise, of a book. So that means it was proofread, edited, the type was set, and the book was published that way. Now, some books, especially books without much text, say a children's book, may have one state, but then there's never any other states. But it could still be a famous book, and it could go through 20, 30, 40 printings and still be in its first edition. So the first edition in itself doesn't quite tell us enough. What you really want is the first printing. So when a publisher publishes a book, chances are they're not going to publish in a first print run very many copies. The exception to this would be very famous authors with a couple big sellers under their belt. Even, an author that has a strong first book, they won't necessarily print a lot of the second book because, again, most books sell very low numbers, and even someone who just had a successful book fairly recently isn't necessarily going to have another successful book. So the first print run is what's collectible. It's collectible because it's the smallest print run in most cases. Now, how do you know something's a first printing? Well, there's several videos online that'll tell you some things to look out for. So I won't belabor the point too much. You've probably already heard about some of them. But in general, modern publishers publish what's called a number line or a letter line on the copyright page. So flip open the book to the copyright page. Somewhere on it, you should see a line of numbers, something like 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A complete number line down to 1 is what you want to look for a first edition. What will usually happen is in the second printing, they'll keep all the same typesetting but just remove the 1. So you'll have a 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and that's how you know that's a second printing. First edition second printings can still have value. They're not equivalent to a terrible reading copy, but really you want to look for first printings if at all possible. They're many times more valuable than a second printing even of a first edition, even if they happen in the same year. It's just a point that people look for when they're going to collect a book that might mean something to them. They look for as many of these points that I'm going to describe as possible. So first edition, first printing is what you want. I mentioned number line. Think of it as pretty much the same thing as a letter line, except A, B, C, D, E, F. A being the first printing, B being the second printing. Not as common, but it does happen. Now, I mentioned that for modern first editions, the number line is pretty much par for the course. As you get older, there's more and more varied ways of figuring out which one's a first edition. So for some books, the only way that you can do it is buy the dust jacket, and there will be several what are called issue points for the first issue dust jacket, often corrected typos, a certain price. Now, because some books you can only tell the first printing from the dust jacket, I guess it's possible that you might have a first issue dust jacket, but that book is not the first printing, and there is no way to know whether it's a first or second printing. But in those cases, if it's a first edition and you have the first issue dust jacket, I mean, the chances it's not also a first printing of the actual book are incredibly small. So not really something that people worry about too much. So as you go back in time, you may have to do more research to figure out, if your favorite book is from the 20s or something like that, you may have to do some research to figure out what are the so-called first issue points. Usually it's typos on a specific page, a certain price. Sometimes a copyright is on both the title page and a copyright page. Sometimes a publisher's name is in a different place. There's all sorts of very small things that can change between states. Some books will just make it easy and they'll say first edition, first printing in separate words, and they'll list all their printings. Sometimes they'll list a later date for a later printing in addition to the original date, or just the later date. So even though it's fairly easy for modern books, like I said, going back further, you're going to have to maybe do a little research to figure out exactly what you've got in your hands. Almost all first editions are hardcover, so the books you'll be looking for will be hardcover books. There's sometimes are exceptions to this. Neuromancer by William Gibson was first published by Ace Sci-Fi as a paperback. So the first printing, first edition of Neuromancer is a paperback. There's no getting around it. There's still very valuable hardcover, quote, first editions published by Victor Glans in London. But if you want to get technical, the first edition is the paperback. Now, one reason people don't like to collect paperbacks is they're much harder to keep in good condition. They don't have dust jackets, and they can't really have dust jackets. And generally, trade paperbacks are made much more cheaply. They won't survive over time. The pages will change colors. People just generally don't like to keep them around. If they have a paperback, it's almost always for reading. Another factor of collectability and value is the supply and demand factor that comes up with almost any kind of collectible. It's very rare that you'll find something that there are many of that are at all valuable. So, for example, not all first edition first printings have much value at all. So, an example that some people like to give is the Harry Potter books. So, the first Harry Potter book, Philosopher's Stone, is extremely valuable in its first printing, first edition. But by the end of the series, when it had become a complete phenomenon, the higher print runs of the later books in the series went into the millions. So whether it's the first printing or not, having a book later in the series, that's a first edition, first printing in great condition, is worth almost nothing because there's so many of them, they're so easy to get, it doesn't really matter much. Now we talked about first printings and how they're usually smaller than later printings and more desirable. So there's other ways that there can be lower print numbers too. There's limited editions, which you don't see so much anymore, but there were periods of time when limited edition signed and numbered gift books were quite popular, especially Arthur Rackham illustrated books of famous stories and tales early in the 20th century. Rip Van Winkle, these kind of classic tales illustrated and in a small print number sometimes signed. So it's not so much that it's an early printing of something that was printed a lot, which is something that's considered valuable, but was in its day printed a limited amount and then never printed again. So you have limited edition gift books, small press, which maybe didn't last for very long and only printed one thing by a certain well-known author, and there were never very many copies and they were never reprinted. There's something else to look at. Now when we talk about first printing, first edition, can you still get confused by this? Well, of course, because a completely different version of the same tale. I mentioned a small press or a limited press doing the Arthur Rackham version of Rip Van Winkle. Well, Rip Van Winkle was a story originally by Washington Irving, and it was published in the early 19th century. So clearly, if you're seeing a first edition, first printing in 1905, that's not the first publication of Rip Van Winkle. Can you always tell just by looking at something in the book whether or not it was published earlier? No. So it's a thing where you're going to have to rely on internet sources and things like that to really know for sure. The other way that you can get tripped up is that different countries may have a publisher that publishes a different version of the same book even around the same time as the original release. So one of the really common things that happens is there will be an American release in addition to a British release, usually published in New York and then London, or London and then New York. So the way you have to deal with that is just through research, figuring out which one came out first. The one that came out first is always the one that you want. So a lot of times a book will be published, say, in New York. It'll kind of take off and be a little bit of a hit, and then publishing house in London may pick it up and publish it the next year. So when you see a first edition, first printing published in London, that may not necessarily be the first printing of that actual book. It's the first printing of that setting of the book by that publisher, but that doesn't mean no one's ever published it before. So you do have to do a little more research. So you definitely always want the one that was published chronologically first. Now, there are times when things are published simultaneously in two different places, say London and New York. That's called simultaneous publication. If you have a book that was published simultaneously in London and New York, it doesn't typically matter so much which one you collect. One rule of thumb is collect the one that was published in the country of the author's origin. So if there's a British author and they simultaneously publish in London and New York, collect the London copy. That's considered the more desirable one by a British author. But if the US one came out the year before and they're British, that happens, then you must collect the American edition because that is the true first edition. And you'll see that language on book descriptions. Someone will say true first edition. Often means that there were other editions that came out later, maybe in different places or limited later or things like that might be more common. And true first edition means just that. Literally nothing came out before that version. So sometimes it'll say the true first Australian edition, like for Shantan books, or the first true American edition. Just make sure you know what you're getting into when you look at these descriptions. The other thing is that any good bookseller will say first UK edition, first American edition. Usually if they specify like that, first UK edition, that means that that is not the true first edition. And that's why they're specifying. That's why they're not flat out just saying first edition. It's kind of confusing because sometimes some places will say true Australian first edition. They're not adding the country because they're trying to be sneaky and that it's not really a first edition, but this is the true first Australian edition. They're usually just trying to get across that we know the first actual edition of this book was published in Australia. That's why we're adding that. So it's a little bit confusing, but there you go. So that's first editions. Now, what books themselves are collectible? Now, if you're a fan of an author who's not very well known, to you, any of their books may be collectible because that's what you want to collect, but I'm kind of trying to dig down into what elements make up valuable books and collectible books. So I'm trying to really talk about, as a whole, what books are valuable and collectible. There's always going to be outliers where one person wants to collect something nobody else in the world does, but that's not what we're talking about here. When you're talking about what actual books to collect, well, famous books is a good place to start. So most books that are famous, especially modern literature, but not too modern, fetch a good deal of money. So lots of 20th century books, by Hemingway, Steinbeck, the famous books, Grapes of Wrath, Sound and the Fury, those books in first edition, first printings are worth a great deal of money. So famous books, historically famous books, some books were not famous in their time that have grown to be much more famous. Famous books, it goes without saying, command some of the highest prices. Another thing that commands high prices is a famous author's first book, some of which aren't very famous. And on the adult side, Stephen King has written many, many books. Hard to say maybe what the most famous is. I don't know. I'm not a huge Stephen King fan. I don't know which of his books have sold the most copies. I imagine Misery probably up there. That's a kind of a mid-period book. Well, Stephen King's first book was Carrie in the 70s. So the first printing of Stephen King's first book as an unknown author was fairly limited, and that book, runs several $1,000s even for something that historically recent. So famous author's first book, not necessarily a famous book, the movie is much more well known, but that's his first published book and it's worth a good amount of money. An author's most famous book is also, either up there, sometimes more expensive, depending on how far into their career the author was. When you look back at authors, it's kind of surprising. Most books that we consider famous were not later in a writer's established career while they were famous. Many, many, many books were early on in the writer's career, sometimes their first, their second book, or even if it wasn't one of their first, they weren't very well known at the time and have grown in stature. So a surprising number of famous, expensive books were early in the career of the authors. So famous author's first book, author's most famous book. Those are kind of two good starting points. Everything else, along the path will have maybe some value. A second book of a famous author before they're well known could definitely have value. But if you're going to be collecting, those are the two things that you'd start with. Now I mentioned famous author's first book and author's most famous book. Another thing along that continuum is books by any author that got turned into popular films, or that got turned into films at all, really, because if a book got turned into a film, its popularity increases a huge amount. So there's a great deal more interest in the public at large about books that were turned into films than books that were not turned into films. So you can just look at any list of famous books. Many of them had very famous film representations of them. To Kill a Mockingbird, a very common example. So that's the things that make the book itself, when you're choosing which actual book you would collect. Those are things that you would look at. That gets into the physical book itself, where you start to talk about book condition. So in the older days of book collecting, pre-internet days, the mere finding of a first edition, first printing, was a big deal. You're collecting around your metro area. Let's say you're not in New York or London. Finding a first edition, first printing of, say, The Grapes of Wrath, that was already your dream. That was already a massive find that you'd celebrate. Well, what's happened is, because of the internet, because every bookseller can be on the internet worldwide, things that people used to think were rare are no longer rare. Just because you've only seen one of X book in the last 20 years as a bookseller, that means it's rare to you. That does not mean it's rare in general. You may have only seen one in 20 years, but then you can look on Bookfinder, ABAA, these kind of sites, and see 20 or 30 of them being sold. So the idea of rarity has really somewhat been eclipsed by book condition. It's no longer enough that you have the first edition, first printing. What people are really looking to collect now, since they have so many more choices for getting a first edition, first printing, is what is the condition of that book? The physical condition of that book. It means nothing in terms of readability, except in an extreme condition of missing pages in the binding or something like that. But in general, the condition of the physical book means nothing for readability, and yet in the post-internet world, condition means everything about the value, nearly everything about the value. The ways you'll see books represented online in terms of condition are several ways. You'll see as new, fine, near fine, very good, good, and fair or presentable. Usually you won't see anyone trying to sell really a fair or poor collectible book, because unless the book is incredibly rare, no one will want to buy a fair copy when a good or better copy exists. So when you're talking about these conditions, an as new book is typically only valid for a very new book in the last several years. Even books that are protected, that are 20, 30 years old, there's almost no way that you will have the kind of tight, bright, all points met that kind of a fresh off the press book would have. So typically when you're looking at books more than a few years old, you're looking for fine copies. So what you'll find is that online, if someone says they have a fine copy, that's what you're looking for. That's supposed to mean there are no visible flaws in the book, despite the fact that it may not have the same brightness and tightness as a brand new off the press book. The binding may not be quite as tight. The cover colors may not be quite as deep and vibrant, but there's no actual issues with the book. The binding is fairly tight. There's no loose papers. There's no cocking of the spine. There's no broken pieces off of the spine. Binding's not coming apart at the seams. There's no foxing and discoloration of pages and oxidization and insect damage and water damage and spotting and coffee stains. None of that can exist in a fine book. And if it does, you're dealing with someone who's misrepresenting the book. Another thing that's common in non-fine books is the glue of the end papers coming undone or lifting off. These are all things that should not be there in a fine book. Another thing you want to look for is no markings, no pencil markings, no circling of words, no highlighting clearly, no writing of the previous owner's name inside of the book, no bookshop inventory markings, no book plates pasted in on the front page and signed with some sort of nonsense. You basically want the book to be as close as it can be to being off the press. That's the book itself. Then you get to the dust jacket. Now, a little history of the dust jacket. Dust jackets were made to protect the book before it was sold. That was the original idea of the dust jacket. The early paper jackets in the 19th century, maybe the late 19th century, were really just for that. They were protect the book until it's sold in stacks, in shelves, and then you'd buy the book, you'd take the dust jacket off, kind of like you would rip the paper off of a present, and now you've got your book, because there could be these really beautifully bound books underneath this jacket, but you don't care about the jacket's going to get thrown away. They're very flimsy usually, not considered part of the book itself. Originally, publishers would use them. They'd put other books by that publisher would be kind of advertised on there. They'd use it as kind of advertisement. They might advertise other books by that author. You might have a logo on the front. You may have a little one-tone color object of some sort on the front as you get later. By the time of The Great Gatsby, dust jackets were starting to be part of what you bought when you bought a book. Now, The Great Gatsby dust jacket is probably the most famous dust jacket, the very deep blue with the eyes in the sky and their lips and the faraway lights. It's considered, one of the best dust jackets ever made, and it's also one of the earlier, substantial dust jackets. But it was published at a time when people were still not really caring about dust jackets. They were throwing them away. And that's why it's not so hard to find a first edition of The Great Gatsby, but it is extremely hard to find a first edition of The Great Gatsby with the dust jacket in good condition. It adds something like $80,000 to the value, 80% of the value of the book. So, I was talking about how the internet has made it so condition is everything. Well, that extends right to the dust jacket. So for starters, you don't ever want to buy a hardcover book that was released with a dust jacket that doesn't have its dust jacket. You may as well skip over those right now. Very few number of books are published without dust jackets at all, but are still hardcover. Mark Halperin's Swan Lake, illustrated by Chris Van Allsburg, originally published without a dust jacket. The second state had a dust jacket, but there isn't one on the first. Sean Tan's The Arrival, the original Australian printing of it, no dust jacket, just hard boards with color printing on the boards, and that's it. Sometimes it's more common with children's books, but almost every book you see that's hardcover will have a dust jacket now. So the dust jacket condition, almost more important than the book condition, because once you get up into collectible books now, unless you're talking really old books, the assumption is that the book itself is probably pretty flawless. That's kind of the working starting point. You will almost never see a decently priced first edition book that has any problems with the book itself, because there's just no reason to sell that as a bookseller when there's so many available. So really, when you're talking about book condition, I did mention all those other items that you're looking for in the condition of the book itself, but you'll rarely see those as an issue, because if someone's selling a fine book, it's not going to have those issues. So that takes you to the dust jacket. So the dust jacket condition, all sorts of things can happen with it. The most common one is that the spine will be faded because most people store books spine out in a bookshelf. The bookshelf is in the sun sometimes, it's in light in general sometimes, indirect sunlight, direct sunlight, fluorescent lights, lamp lights. However it is, over time, that exposed spine will get faded. So that's one of the first things that you will notice. Now, since the advent of Mylar dust jacket protectors and other UV resistant kind of protectors, newer books are much less likely to have this kind of fading, even if they've kind of been in an open case, because they've been protected. So collectors from now on will probably have less of an issue with spine fading, but if you're looking for books from, the 70s, 60s, 50s, or older books, they didn't have Mylar jacket protectors on them most likely. You may get lucky, they may have been stored in a box or out of sight, but still, kept temperature and humidity wise and stuff like that well. Unlikely, but hey. Dust jacket condition, it's very easy to mess up a dust jacket. Moving it from one bookcase to another, you can damage it in all sorts of ways. You can slightly pull on the spine of the dust jacket cover. You have what's called edge wear, which is really common along the bottoms where, when you remove books from a shelf and they kind of grind along the edge. It's also called shelf wear in some cases. Any pulling of a book on and off the shelf eventually is going to mess up, depending on kind of how you've aligned things, either the bottoms of the boards or the jacket. There's kind of no getting around that. That's why if you're going to collect books, you have a reading copy and then you have your collecting version, you probably don't want to take them in and out ever if possible, because pretty much every time you touch it in some way, unless you literally just like touch the end of it and leave it there, you're probably going to damage it in some way. There's all kinds of things that can happen to the dust jacket. The bumped corners will sometimes press it in a little bit. It's kind of an ugly look on the edges that makes the dust jacket no longer fit crisply. There's tears and chips. Chips are pieces completely missing that were kind of ripped off. They can be small, often on the edges of the spine. They can be large, pieces that were ripped off, and the more of that there is, the worse the condition of the dust jacket is considered. And then there's tears. There's entire tears that go across the entire back. Someone had their hand resting on part of the jacket and got up awkwardly holding the book and tore right through it. It happens all the time. There's also what are called closed tears, which are a little bit less of a concern depending on their size. But a closed tear is a tear that you don't really see very much until you kind of get up close to it, because the pieces actually close back together in a way that you don't kind of see where the tear is from afar. That's very common on dust jackets. In fact, beyond a certain age, I would say 90% of the dust jackets you see will have at least some kind of closed tear or chipping, just from the age and the dust jacket getting more brittle. Not the worst thing to have a few closed tears on an older first edition. You're rarely going to find a fine book with a fine, flawless dust jacket older than, say, 20, 30 years. Other things related to the dust jacket: when collecting children's book award winners, Newbery, Caldecott, you don't want the Caldecott or Newbery sticker on the book dust jacket itself. That's considered a no-no for collecting a children's book. The major reason, I think, is probably pretty obvious, which is that when the book comes out, books are never released for the first time having won either of those awards. So clearly those awards are given after they're published. So 99% of the time when you see a children's book with a Newbery or Caldecott medal on it, it's because it's the second or later printing, and they were released by the publisher with the sticker on it after it had won. Now, very occasionally, you will have a first printing with a sticker on it, because sometimes what happens is the publisher will tell the booksellers, especially if the book kind of came out fairly recently, rather than waiting for the second printing, they'll say, hey, this won the Caldecott, this won the Newbery, will you please affix a sticker to the jacket? And we all know why, because award winners sell many, many, many times more than non-award winners in the children's book section of a bookstore. So When you're collecting first editions, first printings, no award medals, no extra stickers, no signed copy stickers. You want nothing on the dust jacket that wasn't there when it came off the presses at the publisher in the first printing. Another thing that affects the dust jacket value is whether it's price clipped or not. So you'll see this all over the place on almost every book description at a fine bookseller. Price clipped means that the price is cut off of one of the flaps of the dust jacket. Usually the flaps, very, very occasionally, it might be on the bottom of the back of the book, something like that. But printings of books usually have a retail price on them. So when books were given as gifts, especially, gifts to children from other people and things like that, a lot of times they'd clip the price off of the dust jacket, which is people, trying to do the right thing etiquette-wise, but unfortunately, price clip jackets lose value as opposed to non-price clip jackets. So most of the time when you're searching for children's books, or non-children's books too, but especially children's books, they will have the price cut off. So when you see a description of a book that has a fine dust jacket, not price clipped, that's what you're looking for, because it feels really nice to be able to hold the complete original dust jacket, nobody messing with it, no chunk taken out of it. It's just an altogether better, more desirable copy. The other good thing about not price clipping it is that you'll see the original price, and sometimes that price will help you determine whether or not it's a first printing. Like I said earlier, sometimes you can only tell if it's a first printing if the dust jacket is the first issue, first printing jacket. And that's usually done by price, because usually a price will go up in a later printing, although not always. So just something to keep in mind. Now, I already mentioned Mylar dust jacket protectors. They're an absolute must. Even if you're at a garage sale and you buy a first edition book without a dust jacket protector, as fast as you can, get one onto it, because you'll be protecting your investment. They're very good now. They don't occlude the kind of visual look of a book at all. They're completely transparent. They're UV resistant. You won't have to worry nearly as much about damaging the book anymore. Scratches and things like that on the outside. You're keeping yourself away from the dust jacket itself. And that's really the best thing that you can do, is protect it as much as possible. They're very good. There's no reason not to get one. It's almost impossible not to damage a book that is missing one of those protectors. So that's the condition of the book, the condition of the dust jacket. Now we talk about author autograph signings. So there's several different kinds of signing to be aware of. The first thing is what's called flat signed. That's usually the kind of signing that, a popular author at a kind of crowded signing will give. The endless line of people bringing their new book up. They'll sign their name, maybe then a year. How are you? Nice to meet you. Bye. Next guy. That's called flat signing. Then there's called inscription, or inscribed copies. Inscribed copies are given to a specific person by name in the signing. So it'll say, to Paul, your friend, and then a signature. Something like that. That's a very basic inscription. Now, very valuable copies of some famous books have had very long inscriptions. There's been Robert Frost books of poetry that have an entire, short poem inscribed to whoever he was inscribing it to. There's books that have been inscribed to other famous authors, other famous people, their editor, their children. These are things that have great, great value compared to a flat signed copy. And then kind of another type kind of goes along with inscription, but is for illustrators. There's inscription or signing with a sketch. So a lot of times a illustrator will not only sign their name, but do some kind of doodle or sketch with their signature. If you're collecting stuff signed by illustrators, those carry great value. Because clearly if you're in a giant line of people going to see an illustrator, he's not going to be doing sketches for hundreds of people. So the idea is the sketch means more thought was put into this inscription, way more than a flat signature. Very desirable. So there's a little bit of controversy with signed books. What people thought before, and how I personally think, is that the more that's written on the signed copy by the author or illustrator, the better. That would place the flat signed variety at the very bottom of the totem pole. Here's their name, here's a signature. You hope it's real. A professional can often tell if the signature is real or fake. sometimes it's a little hard. It was always considered more desirable the more that they wrote. Inscriptions of anything, sketch dated to a person with a little note, was always considered more valuable than flat signed. What's happened recently is there's this idea that some booksellers have and some book buyers have, that if there's an inscription and it's not to them personally, it takes away from the perceived desirability of the book. So sometimes you'll see booksellers now list the book as being flat signed, inscribed, not inscribed to anyone. Here's a sketch and he signed it and it's not inscribed to anyone. They're not saying this because they want you to know about a problem with the book. They're saying it because, hey, maybe you don't want an inscription copy. I personally think inscription's always better. The more writing from the author that's on the physical book, the more it likely meant to them to write it, the less rushed and impersonal the situation was where they signed it, and the better the value. That is my opinion. That's the opinion of probably the majority of people and sellers. You will notice that there are some sellers that advertise the fact that the book is not inscribed to a specific person. The other thing you want with the signature, if possible, is the date. That also helps provenance and accuracy of valuing, and the more information about how this book was published and signed and how it came to be, the better. Now, for the date itself, the closer the date is to publication, the more valuable the dated signature. We were talking about To Kill a Mockingbird. A To Kill a Mockingbird signed first edition, signed the year it came out, which off the top of my head I don't know, would be much more valuable than one signed 30, 40 years later. So, just another thing to look for. Something people often do regarding provenance is they will take a picture of an author at a signing event and sign and date the photo, sometimes with themselves in it, just to prove, here's me at a signing, this is clearly the author. Could you just use someone else's photo of being at a signing? Sure, but it's better than nothing. Also, regarding provenance, sometimes, like I said before, the inscription presentation will be to an editor or someone else famous. That's really good provenance right there, because some of these copies are known to have existed. And if you're the new owner of it, someone well-versed in that author's first editions will say, oh, you have the copy that went to so-and-so. That's a valuable copy. That's a tangible, valuable copy they know about existing. It's not just some flat signed thing that could be something else. So that's the deal with signatures. Now, a couple last things before this gets extremely long. Regarding condition, older books you see listed as fine may not be fine in the traditional sense, but people get much more lenient about condition and how the condition is described the older the book gets. So a book that came out in 2014 that's listed as fine, well, that's a little bit of a head scratcher, because if it's that recent, you're wondering, well, what's happened to it where they can't just say as new, right? So to me, that's a little ominous, because a lot of people will say as new for a new book. They'll specifically say it's like new, it's unread. That's a more typical way you'd find a brand new first edition. A book from the 1930s or 40s that says fine, usually when you read the fine print a little bit, you'll see that there are actual flaws that they describe. There could be closed tears, there could be foxing, a little bit of spotting. Sometimes they'll still call that fine. And it's not considered shady for older books to be called fine, even with condition items. Children's books also, people are a little more lenient, because children's books, especially the dust jacket covers, often get a little roughed up, and more roughed up than a normal book. So people are more lenient. Part of the reason is because it's harder to get children's picture books, especially in truly fine condition with no issue items at all. Not impossible, but difficult. And because it's possible, those command a very high price. So you may see a children's book that's a normal first edition, very good condition, with several different condition items, maybe $500, one with maybe one little tear, but otherwise good, maybe $1,000, and a completely flawless one, maybe $2,000 asking. Like I said, condition now is everything, and the higher you kind of go up on the condition scale and the fewer condition items, it's almost like an exponential curve with the pricing sometimes, because people say, well, you're willing to pay $1,000 for an almost perfect one, would you pay $2,000 for a perfect one? How anal are people going to be about their favorite book? Are they going to be angry with themselves that they see a perfect copy that they don't have? Are they going to be angry enough to kind of sell their copy and get this new one? And I think that's what often happens is people want the best quality book they can find, especially if they're only collecting a small amount of books because, they don't need to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to have this big collection. They just might want a few of their favorite books and they want to collect those and they want the best copy possible. So the pricing kind of goes through the roof for really, really high quality books. So if you're buying online, the ABAA is the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, abaa.org. They have a complete search engine and direct buy e-commerce site. Those are considered the highest end booksellers in America. Now, you will pay higher prices for sure. You will most likely get much more knowledgeable booksellers than elsewhere on the internet. I personally have been a little disappointed with some of the customer service treatment I've had from ABA sellers. I've had books listed as new, and you get them and there's all kinds of problems and you have to send them back. So I wouldn't wholeheartedly recommend the ABA, but I would say that they will usually have the best condition quality copies that you can find online. A good site to use is Bookfinder, where you can search and then filter it to just first editions. And then you'll kind of see the prices splay out from low to high. And as you go up the price ladder, you'll see the condition get better and better and better. And then, these start to be signed, and these start to be inscribed, or here's a review copy given to the publisher, given to the author before it was published. And you get all the way up to the top, and there's usually some very overpriced things that are kind of, wouldn't it be nice prices, but probably no one's going to pay that. So you want to kind of look in maybe the 75, 80 percentile is usually the sweet spot where you'll see really high quality, fine condition copies of the book you're searching for without being really overpriced and without having a bunch of condition items or maybe a shady dealer. It's very important to get photos. Different sellers have different ideas about what things mean, and some people leave off condition items intentionally because they're hoping they can get someone to order it who doesn't care that much. I think a lot of sellers expect these books to be given as gifts, which first editions often are, and someone who doesn't know a lot about first editions will probably buy a book for a kid or a brother-in-law or whatever, and it's good enough. And here, I got you first edition. They're not so concerned about the fact that it has a chip missing in the spine or whatever. So always get photos. A lot of sellers have photos, but a lot of sellers don't have photos. And even if they do have a photo, the ones that do often don't have high resolution photos of the front, the back, the boards, the inscription if it's inscribed. You want all of that. You want as many pictures as possible. A really reputable, respectable seller will give you as many pictures as you want. They're set up to do that. They won't complain. Par for the course. Don't feel like you're putting anybody out by asking for photos. Definitely get photos because you want to know what you're getting. You want to know what the seller is putting in the box when they send it to you. A lot of times people will chalk it up to, the person who packed it and the way it moved around in the package, and you just damaged it when you took it out. It was fine when it left here. Get the photos, then there's no question. So, beware when you buy on eBay. There's all kinds of reasons not to. Number one, you'll see stuff listed as first editions that's not a true first edition, and they won't mention that because they just look in the front of the book and it says first edition. They don't know any better. They think it'll get them $10 more on eBay. Boom, they write it in the description. As we talked about earlier, it might also mean that it's the first edition, a later printing. Any reputable bookseller, when they say first edition, they'll know that the people looking for first editions, when they're looking for those words, they really mean first printing. Sometimes on the front of the bookseller's website, it'll say, all first editions are also first printings unless otherwise stated. So that way they can just say first edition as a shorthand and it means first printing. If it's not a first printing, you'll usually see first edition later printing. On eBay though, anything goes. People put first edition for all sorts of reasons, whether they really think it is or not, just to get your attention, just to go into searches. There's a couple companies specifically on Bookfinder whose books come up as first editions, and pretty much no matter what you search for $10 or $12. I don't know what that is. I haven't really looked into it. But beware of scams. You'll have crappy photos on eBay. You'll have books from gigantic retail sellers that have hundreds of thousands of eBay feedback, and there's no possible way you'll ever get any sort of customer service out of them. Anything that seems too good to be true on the internet usually is. Everyone knows that by now. You're much better off paying a little more for a place that seems like they know about all the kind of things I've been talking about. They're using these terms. They're putting a good level of description in their book descriptions. So be very careful. Also, most of the time you buy on eBay, you cannot return your book. So ABAA sellers and reputable, rare booksellers, usually you can return the book for any reason under a certain amount of time for a complete refund, not credit, as long as it's in the same condition. And that's another reason to get photos before, so that, if they're accusing you of having damaged the book in some way, you have your own photos of your book, they have their photos before they sent it. If they're claiming damage, they need to now send you photos again of what the book looks like now, and you guys can compare. Be very, very wary of eBay. I would say if there's a book that's $50 on eBay, and it seems like it might be what you want, but it's $200, say on an ABAA bookseller site, I would spend the $200. That's just me personally. It all depends on, your financial situation and what you want to do. But I would say, if you don't have the money to do the $200 book as opposed to the $50 book, you probably shouldn't be worrying about collecting first editions. If you can only spend $50 on a book, just buy reading copies and don't kind of tear your hair out over all these details, because you're going to need some bankroll. If you're collecting recent signed first editions from the past 10 years, they're still often going to be over $100 each, even if they're high printings. If you're going back into the 70s and 80s picture books and Stephen King, Carey, you're getting into a lot of Caldecott winners in the 80s are $500,000, $1,500. And then when you go back further, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 books. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory signed in fine condition, you see them for $7,500. It's not a hobby for someone who's really strapped for cash. If you want to collect books and you're strapped for cash, just buy reading copies. Collect all the books by so-and-so. You can do it for incredibly cheaply. That's one of the great things about the internet if you don't have much money, is you go on Bookfinder, search for the book, don't limit it to first editions. Like I said, you can get any book for a few dollars. So if you cannot spend a few $100s on a book, probably not the best hobby. Anyway, that's a huge amount of what I know and what I've picked up about book collecting and collecting first editions. There's some stuff we didn't talk about regarding older antiquarian books, like fine bindings and things like that. But maybe that'll be for another time. So I hope this has been educational. And let me know in the comments if you have any questions.